Join us this new year for new conversations at the Commonwealth Club.
Hello and welcome to today's virtual Commonwealth Club event. I'm John Bolin, President Emeritus of KQED and Vice Chair of the Commonwealth Club Board of Governors. It is my pleasure to introduce David Gergen, Senior Political Analyst at CNN and author of the new book, Hearts Touched with Fire: How Great Leaders Are Made. David has been a leader in public arena for more than half a century. He has served as a White House advisor to 4 U.S. presidents of both parties, Nixon, Ford, Reagan, and Clinton. For the past 20 years, he has been a professor and the founding director of the Center for Public Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School, where he mentors and works with a rising generation of new leaders. In his latest book, David asks the important questions: what does leadership look like, and how are great leaders made? A quick reminder to our audience, we encourage you to submit your questions in the text chat on YouTube. David, welcome to the Commonwealth Club. Let me start off by asking you, given your years dealing with leadership and leading the Institute at the Kennedy School, how'd you decide to write this book now?
Well, I've been thinking about it for a long time, John. First of all, let me say how delighted I am to return to the Commonwealth Club. I don't know how many sessions I've had over the years, but I think we're almost in double digits at this point. And to have someone, John, as distinguished as you with your long career in public television as well as journalism more generally, it's just good to be here. I feel like I'm coming home.
We're delighted to have you.
Thank you. So I've been thinking about writing a book about leadership, what I've learned over the years, for a number of years, frankly. I wanted a legacy book, in effect. I wanted someplace where I could sum up what I've learned over the years and draw lessons not only from my own experience, but from history as well as contemporary affairs. But life kept on getting in the way. There were all sorts of distractions, things I needed to do, things I needed to pay attention to. We have, our public life has accelerated enormously. Just trying to keep up with what's going on in life, leaves us exhausted. But the bottom line is that I've been toying with the idea of a book. My assistants, I'm surrounded usually by assistants who have recently come out of college, and they're terrific, research and administration stuff. But in any event, they kept on saying, really, really, really ought to do this. And I'd sort of semi-resisted because, as I say, kept getting in the way. But the urgency that is now upon us, I think all of us feel about where are we as a people and where are we going? We're clearly on an unsustainable path, but we don't know where the path leads. And more, I think our future rests with the younger generations that are coming up. The long-term future is going to be more with them, certainly, than it is with people who are now in charge. And I do think I think the question really should be, when should we pass the baton from older Americans to younger Americans? And my answer is soon. Now would be good if we started doing this because the stakes are so.
To that point, in the introduction, you write about young leaders who have actually ignited movements, including Greta Thunberg, the Parkland students, Tamara Burke, and others who've leveraged new technology to lead. What is the latest technology changed about leadership? And then what's still essential that's not new?
Well, I think that what we've discovered over the last few years is that social media is a two-edged sword. Like most new technologies, there are aspects of it which are, I think, very positive. And that is that the social media now gives everyone in the country can have a voice. You don't have to be rich. You don't have to be from elite schools. You can just get on there and get on Twitter and build a reputation. And then you can acquire a lot of admiration and stature very, very quickly. Look at AOC, a classic case. A young woman working behind a bar for a number of years, but then was persuaded to jump in politically, and she did that. And and she has a national following now. She's an important figure. So there is a lot more access, and that is a good thing. The more we can sort of flatten the hierarchies we have in our society, the better. However, now we've had over the last few years a lot of irresponsible people who are just manufacturing snark and disinformation. They've increased. They have an increasingly big space on the internet, and I do think that has been destructive. It played into the false argument that Trump had won the last election, which I think further divided the country and poisoned our politics. And we see it how so many people have been dragged down in the mud. Once you get your head above the parapet these days, the incoming shots can be pretty strong coming on social media. So it has this dual quality, and I think there's going to be. I think we're going to be spending a lot of time and effort in the next few years. It's going to be a very rough few years in my judgment. But I think one of the most important issues we have to deal with is disinformation. Who can you trust in today's environment? Trust, as you know, has almost collapsed. Public trust in many of our leaders and in many of our institutions, and it leaves the country itself in an increasingly perilous position.
Yeah. Looking back a little bit, you reference also the famous Joseph Campbell interviews with Bill Moyers. What is it about Campbell's theory of leadership that you think is still pertinent today?
Yes, well, I'm glad you raised that. Many people have almost forgotten Joseph Campbell, but in his time, especially in his interview with Bill Moyers, especially on PBS, as you know, the series that he had, Joseph Campbell set out to understand the differences, but also the similarities among cultures over time, among different civilizations over time. And he concluded that there were certainly certain basic narratives that apply to many, many societies and to what's going on for individuals. And Campbell himself wrote about what he called the hero's journey. And that is, metaphorically, it's the young knight in a castle who hears about a young damsel in another castle who has been locked up by some awful evil figure, a dragon maybe. And so the young prince leaves the castle and goes to the other castle, and where he takes on the dragon, slays the dragon, with enormous effort and many, many dangers, slays the dragon, brings the princess home, and they live happily ever after. But that hero's journey is that going out and taking risks in life, getting beat up sometimes, but often seeking what's the best in life. And that's what Campbell was talking about. And it's been adapted by people in what's called the leadership school now, people who not only practice leadership, but think about it a lot or write about it, do research on it. And the recognition is now that frequently in political life, there is a journey. The journey starts from within. It's something inside you. It's not working with others, but rather it is whether you have self-awareness. And if you have sufficient self-awareness, can you learn to control your emotions? Can you learn to control to stick to a true north, to your values and principles that you accumulate over time? Can you in fact have a good journey? And once you sort of have yourself under control, there is the additional outer journey, as I've described in the book, is when you essentially leave the nest and then rub up against a lot of other people that you've never met before. You don't know. They're all new experiences. You have to work with a team. You started out somewhere down in a lower level, a lower part of the hierarchy in any team. And you have to learn how to manage your boss, your principal. How does she learn? How does she make decisions? How can you be helpful to her to make sure she succeeds, and in turn the group succeeds? And you have to learn how to then work with a group. You have to learn how to work laterally with people. You have to learn how to build a team which is reporting into you. So there is a lot that goes into accumulating the capacity and the judgment for strong leadership. That does not speak necessarily to character or to courage and some of the elements we really want in our leaders.
Tell us how early 20th century Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes influenced your selection of the book's title.
Well, I'm so glad you asked that. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. is a storied figure in many law schools. I had the privilege of going to the Harvard Law School, and he was sort of an iconic figure that we studied. And he was very, very tart with his commentary, but he was a wonderfully interesting man. And the reason that he rose to, why I like talking about it, is because there's a little story behind it. When Holmes grew up here in Boston, and his parents were very prominent in the community. And when Lincoln issued his first call for volunteers in the Civil War, Holmes was 23, and but because he came from such an illustrious family, he could have ducked. He could have paid his way out of it. That's what happened to Teddy Roosevelt's father. He ducked, and Teddy Roosevelt was always embarrassed that his father had ducked, and Holmes was determined not to do that. So he signed up for the Union forces. And in a few years that passed, that followed, he was grievously wounded on 3 occasions in 3 different battles. In the last of them, he was left for dead on the battlefield. And it was only by a miracle that he survived. And so that all sort of paints the picture of how difficult, how hard it was for him, and how dangerous it was. But he did put his life on the line. Now, 20 years later, in a Memorial Day speech, Holmes decided to reflect on what it had been like for his generation coming through the Civil War together. So many of them killed, so many wounded. It sounded pretty horrible in many, many ways. Holmes gets up and says, actually, you really need to be involved in the passions of your time. What man or woman you want to be involved and engaged in the passions of your time, lest it seems you haven't lived. And he said, talking about the Civil War generation that paid such a high price, he said, in our early days, we were fortunate that we lived through the passions of our time. He said, and our hearts were touched by fire. Our hearts were touched by fire. He, as so many others have discovered, is if you throw yourself into trying to do good in the world, it may be very dangerous. You may have a short life, but there is something about that you will find fulfilling that you will not find simply by making a living and earning money. That's not the purpose of life, is to earn a little more money than your neighbor. The purpose is nobler than that. And Holmes saw it in noble moral terms. And I thought that phrase, hearts touched with fire, captured Holmes so well. I really wanted to use it as on the cover of the book. And I knew people like you might ask the question, what's this all about?
Yeah. That's a great story. And speaking of leaders who do good, you talk about leaders who were not politicians, but really what you might call servant leaders, or people who serve, like Eleanor Roosevelt, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Francis Perkins.
Right.
Do politicians run for office generally to serve the public or for other reasons?
Well, they tend to, I think they tend to run early on because they genuinely want to make a difference. But there are all sorts of temptations that come into a life like that you really have to be on guard about. People can wave money at you to try to entice you into voting for a bill. They lobby you. They set up things in your name. And by the way, they may slip money under the table. There are a lot of nefarious things that can take place as people sort of grow accustomed to power and want to stay in power. The more noble approach to when you are called by your country is that of Cincinnatus, who famously was a Roman who was a farmer, and he was at his plow when people came to him and said, "You've been brave in the past. Would you come and help fight off the heathens who are trying to overthrow us?" And Cincinnatus left his plow, came and fought, and then went home. He didn't. He gave up all the purposes of power. Well, that has been a story that has inspired generations. Someone else who really lived a similar life was George Washington. He famously, was approached about putting his uniform back on. He did it somewhat reluctantly. He was worried he was going to lose his good name, but he did it. And had it not been for Washington throwing himself into the breach, it's so telling what would have happened in the early days in the colonial wars. Fortunately, he did the right thing. even though it cost him a lot. I mean, and he got up to a bad start. George Washington lost the first 6 out of the first 8 battles his troops fought, and he had to change his strategy in midstream, which he did successfully. But the interesting thing was how he went back to his plow. When George III was told that Washington was going to go home, he said, if he puts down power, if he gives it up, for 400 years, people who won wars grabbed power. They exercised power. But George III said, if Washington gives up power, he will become the most important man and the most respected man in the world. And that's just what happened.
Huh. That's a great story.
Yeah.
You raised one interesting question in the book about whether leadership even matters, and
yes.
Quoting Tolstoy and Schlesinger.
Yes.
What's that Tolstoy-Schlesinger debate?
Yeah, sure. No, Tolstoy believed in what's called determinism, and that is that fate decides outcomes, and that you ought to respect fate and not put so much time and effort into individuals. But that was the notion. So, for example, Tolstoy argued in World War and Peace that if Napoleon hadn't been the French general who went in to invaded the Soviet, the Russia, it would have been some other French general who would have done it, basically made the same mistake. So there is that school that says no, individuals. In fact, Tolstoy said that individuals are the slaves of history. They're acting out what has been preordained. Well, along come many sort of more contemporary, social scientists, historians like Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who've determined no. If you really take that view of life, you remove all sense of human agency, and the important thing is how you live your life and how you can shape your life and then help to make the world a little better place. And you ought never to think that you're simply a slave of history. And that was a very sharp distinction that I think over time, Schlesinger generally won that argument. We say today, if you shoot somebody, we're going to look at intention. We're going to look at whether you were crazy. And we're going to let you off if you, in fact, had no control. But we put you in jail and we keep you there. If you exercise your human agency, you hurt somebody. And so it's a meaningful distinction, but I think that we've resolved it pretty well, at least in leadership literature, but maybe not among fiction writers. But I think it's pretty well come down one way. But the other question you raised, John, is how do leaders really matter? Does it matter whether we have somebody who's good or somebody bad? And on that one, I think the evidence is equally clear. Schlesinger, in this case, comes back with a different story. He said, look, this is Schlesinger Jr. talking to the historian. He, by the way, a great friend of Jack Kennedy's. He worked in the Kennedy White House and was a prominent advocate for him. But anyway, so Schlesinger says, look, in 1931, a young British politician was in New York City giving a talk. He got into a taxi cab on Park Avenue. When he got out of the cab, he didn't look. He looked the wrong way to see if a car was coming. And as he crossed, he was struck down by a taxi traveling about 35 miles an hour. And the British politician, said it was just by luck. He said I felt like being squeezed like a gooseberry. So 14 months later, there was a young American politician in an open car in Miami when a gunman came and fired at point blank range at this American politician. Had it not been for a woman who jarred the arm of the shooter, the assassin, that American politician would have died on the spot. So the question Schlesinger argues is, did it make any difference in history that young British politician was Winston Churchill? And did it make any difference in history that young American politician was Franklin Roosevelt? And in each case, historians are generally agreed that the alternative to Churchill in British society, the alternative to Franklin Roosevelt in America, could not have given a voice to the British Lion during the Second World War and could not have guided the United States through the Depression and World War II. So if you look at it, there's a strong argument that individual leaders do matter. Ask yourself this: in our own time today, look at Ukraine. Zelensky clearly matters in what's happening, what's unfolding in Ukraine. I mean, here's a guy who was, came out of the entertainment industry, got into politics, sort of a side door. Wasn't doing very well there when he first became leader of the nation. But when the Russians invaded, Zelensky rose to the occasion. And that's what often happens when crises hit. Somebody rises to the occasion. It's for at least a period of time, like George Washington in the colonial war, Rudy Giuliani in 9/11. That brief period of time, Rudy Giuliani was one of the most popular people in the country because of the way he responded. And now Zelensky in Ukraine. I think one of the questions we have to ask ourselves today is, where are our Zelenskys of today in America? How is it we have so few heroes? What is it that we can do to restore a sense of having heroes? People we look up to, people we can point our kids toward and say, learn to live like this person, follow this person, because you'll learn a lot about how to be successful in life and how to have a good life.
It's not exactly related, but what is the great man theory, and why has it been largely abandoned?
Well, that's a good question. You've thought about this a lot, John. I appreciate that. Historically, I think Joseph Campbell probably had a lot to do with this. Also, historically, we have often thought that we needed to be saved. Their savior figure would come in on a white horse, come galloping in, and again rescue us from problems. And that was sort of the theory that a lot of people still believe that we need to believe in greatness, and I think we do to an extent. But there is something else that has come into the picture now that I think is best exemplified by two photographs. One photograph, very memorable, is of John F. Kennedy as president in the Oval Office at dusk, hunched over, looking out into and beyond the White House, but also having a globe in front of him. And you have a sense this man in his loneliness is carrying the burden of the country. That is what leadership is all about. Well, it is true we need our Kennedys, but increasingly, the picture that makes the most sense of, say, our recent president, Barack Obama, the memorable picture there is Obama in the Situation Room of the White House, surrounded by his Secretary of Defense, his Secretary of State, his National Security Advisor. There are 7 or 8 people because they're watching the capture of Osama, and they're doing it from afar. But the important point is it is a collective of people. It is a group of collaborators who are in the room, not a single individual like Kennedy all alone. In fact, most decision making is made and most progress now comes through constructive collaboration within a team, between one team and another team. The variations are numerous, but the outcomes often point to the fact that a group of people can make a decision that perhaps has more impact. There was a woman named Patty Stonesifer, who was the first CEO of the Gates Foundation, and she used to say, according to an old African proverb, which I like a lot, she said, "If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together." I think there's a lot of truth to that.
Two of the important leaders you write about are John Lewis and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. How did their early experiences, which were very different, galvanize their leadership?
Well, one I think he did much earlier in life. John Lewis did, and he came up in poverty in Alabama. He was a descendant of slaveholders, of slaves, and he wasn't sure he'd ever get out of Alabama. Now was attracted, as Martin Luther King was. John Lewis was attracted to the ministry because that's where many black churches, that's where the power is, and also that's also where there's so much respect for the leadership. And one of John Lewis's assignments from his parents was to look after the chickens, the chicken coop. So Lewis went out during the day. He wrote about this in his memoir. He would go out during the day, and he would act like these chickens these chicks were his parishioners in a church, and he would preach at them. He'd send them and preach at them, and then he often baptized them, and he put them in the water and baptized. But John, one of his problems was he took a chick, but he held it underwater too long, and the chick came out, was motionless, couldn't move, and Lewis thought, "I've killed my chicken." Unfortunately, over time, as the little chick grew a little drier, it came back to life. But it was one of the stories that you sort of have to guffaw over the whole thing. But John Lewis, there was such a within the civil rights movement, it was broad based, mostly led by Negroes, by Black Americans, mostly male in the early '60s. Not very many whites participated. Some did valiantly, as they did in Mississippi. People went down to Mississippi to see if they could get voting rights for blacks and that sort of thing, which was very helpful. But John Lewis was increasingly drawn into. He went to college and then got very much involved with civil rights. So he was one of the main speakers at King's both Lincoln Memorial and August of '63. John Lewis was one of them. I think he was the last speaker, and he did a very, very good job of it. But one of the things that Lewis disagreed with about what was going on in the civil rights movement was the leadership was all top down. It was like there were like 6 or 7 people that really held the reins, and they held them tightly because they were worried that there might be violence or whatever. And so there was some reason to hold reins tightly. But Lewis split away and went to work for something for them became SNCC. It was a student nonviolent SNCC, student nonviolent student association, or association. But anyway, that's where he went. And John Lewis very much made his reputation among the younger leaders, and in the belief of having leadership come from the bottom up, not just from the top, but have it bubble up from communities. That gives you a much stronger sense of faith, and that worked for him. Of course, when he got his head beaten in at the Pettus Bridge in Selma during that whole period of time, he darn near died from it. He had a concussion, was really badly hurt. But that gave me more authority because he had sacrificed in a way he did. So, there are a number of leaders out of the civil rights movement who have been really very, very important to our. Every time you go through Union Station, you can't help but look at the head of the union there for blacks was a great big statue. There are people like that, who are in numerous memorable positions. But I think it's important to understand that there's something new. There is something new in the civil rights movement, and that is what Lewis came to represent. And that is the bubbling up from the bottom. Is now the philosophy of Black Lives Matter. They feel the same way that you ought to have responsibility coming out. There's no single leader. What we don't know and what the jury is still out on is, can you get big things done when you have a bubble up, bottoms up situation? Will that work for you in the end? Because there's nobody there who can make the final call. Who calls the shot in the end? In a hierarchical situation, the leader is one who calls the shot. So we'll have to wait and see. I think it's a brave initiative, and we all hope for them to succeed.
Yeah. You also cite John McCain, who was neither a good student in terms of grades or behavior, but he held to a code of honor. Could you define honor and integrity as they were exhibited by McCain?
Only if the honor lies, I think, in going back to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. We should have finished there, and I'm sorry I didn't. My fault. But because I think it's important to understand that one of the great things that's happening today is that so many more leaders are women, so many more leaders are people of color, and I think that's been very positive for the country. And sexual gender identities, all those things are blending in, as you know so well from San Francisco and the Commonwealth Club. But Ruth Bader Ginsburg was mostly a student, a very firm student of the law, and she became very quickly as she was studying the law, she became an advocate for women and laws toward women that she felt were very discriminatory. And she was deeply involved for most of her career at trying to clear away those barriers and really giving women an equal shot in the workplace and in life in general. But she also, there was a heroic quality about her because she had so much stamina, and she was a woman who was slight. You didn't see a lot of power in her slightness, but you got a lot of power in her words. She could cut you down like that. She could be witty and she could be very ironic. And I always enjoyed listening to her because she could always say something really fascinating. But when she was she and her husband were both in law school, and they had a couple of children, small children. So she had her hands full. Law school, young husband, children. And then her husband was diagnosed with cancer. And she had no choice, but in effect, to become to substitute for him as well as for her. And so she did his homework and she did her homework. And she would be up to 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, usually, trying to hold things together. Her mother was had some health issues. Her children had some issues. You know, she persevered against long odds, and over time became, I think, one of the most admirable women in the country. Lots and lots of young women gravitated to her position. She's criticized in retrospect for not quitting earlier and opening up a slot that Mitch McConnell could block and getting another jurist coming from a Democratic nomination, Democratic White House, let's say. And you know, I must say, I think it's understandable why she held on the way she did. I'm not among her critics on that. I think overall, this woman led a marvelous life and left a grand legacy, along with some other women, to be sure, and women who were on the court. But Ruth Bader Ginsburg was very special.
I do want to ask you about the harrowing experience you had with the Ku Klux Klan when you were quite young. What did you learn from that? I mean, what did you take away from that?
Good question, fair question. I mean, a little context. In the early '60s, civil rights, was very much in the saddle, and we were all concerned with it. There was violence. There was violence in the streets, and an effort to go after young blacks. And there were three young whites who went to Mississippi, for example, to work on voter registration, who were all murdered, and ruthlessly murdered, brutally murdered. And so there was that in the air. There were other black leaders who were gunned down during that same period of time. Well, I grew up in the South, in North Carolina. And my dad was a mathematician. He was a big academic, but we grew up in very modest means. I lived on a dirt road, and went to segregated schools, and that's the way it was in those days. But in any event, we elected a governor named Terry Sanford, who was very similar to Jack Kennedy. He had the same kind of charisma that Kennedy had, and he was our Jack Kennedy for North Carolina. And he was also very progressive and very pro-civil rights. Started an effort called the North Carolina Good Neighbor Council to set up councils in cities across the state that would be made up of leading black citizens and leading white citizens working together for the community on school, on education, public education, and on jobs. But very importantly, also to try to keep peace and rid ourselves of violence. And those were called North Carolina Good Neighbor Councils. Well, I was fortunate enough to get a job with a guy who ran the Good Neighbor Councils, who had been a staunch segregationist, converted to integrations. He had no staff. He had a secretary when I joined. I became his staff, one person. I drove Mr. Dave around, David Coltrane. I was his chief policy guy. I was his chief communications guy. To some extent, I was chief PR guy. But I was basically his gopher as well. So we had a grand relationship, and I worked for him for 3 summers. And I can just tell you that in and of itself made it one of the most enriching and I think fulfilling experiences I've ever had in public life. There's much more glamour in the White House, of course, but and if you're working out in your community, you really can see the differences, the changes that made. You can help them along, you nurse them along, you make friends, new friends. You don't do it sort of abstractly from a distance, 1,000 miles away, pushing buttons. That's a way to get things done, but you don't have any sort of. You're not in the arena really. You're sort of on the sidelines, as I say, pushing buttons. So I found working that way was terrific, and there was a time when the KKK was very, very powerful in North Carolina, especially in the western part of the state. And I was when one of the summers I was working on civil rights. The planned a big rally down in the southwest, and I went to the rally, accompanying a classmate of mine from high school who was working then as an associate pastor at my church, and two other fellows, and we had a car of four, and we drove into the parking lot, great big car parking lot out in the middle of the field. And when we drove in, there was a gate, and the police were on the other, there on the road, ushering cars in. But once you got past that little thin line of police, the order was all being set by a bunch of really burly, mean-looking guys in mostly brown shirts, who were basically in charge. And so we went with some trepidation over to the edge of the rally to see, and we had a chance to really get engaged in what they were doing, but we had not realized how much animosity we were, by just our very presence, was ticking people off, like the people there as white supremacists. So they came and took some of our stuff, and we were trying to record some things. But very importantly, when we went back to our car to leave at the end of the evening, there must have been 300 or 400 people circling our car, all very angry, all yelling at us, telling us we should never have come there. We would make sure that we never came there again. They were really threatening us, and I was quite scared. We were able to make it over to the car, and they let us open the door, and we piled in. I was riding shotgun. I turned to my classmate and said, we only have one chance of getting out of here. You've got to turn on the ignition. Go as slowly, creep as slowly as you can, but we got to get the hell out of here. We're going to, because they're dancing on the roof. They're going to be coming after us soon, and they're going to get very bloody. So we turned, gently moved so we wouldn't run over anybody. And we thought, okay, we're fine. And only to find when we got on the highway, there were a bunch of cars that chased us on the highway. Coming all around us, yelling at us one day or another. It was a really scary night. I thought in the end, I deserved some blame. It was too reckless. We should have better known what we were getting into. And there's something about, it was like a red flag waving at a bull. If you do that, you're going to get the bull charged up. Well, we did that to these people, the KKK. So as much as I hated what they represented, I felt we bore some of the blame for not invading their territory. It was obviously their territory. They didn't have much in life. They could occupy a field. So what you don't want is a lot of violence.
So changing the subject completely,
Sure.
Who make better leaders, introverts or extroverts?
Well, historically, people all thought the inverts, were made worse leaders. They just didn't connect. By the very definition of being an introvert, there's a woman whose name I think Kathleen, who's written a book about extroverts here in the last 5 years, arguing no, extroverts can do, introverts can do all the things extroverts can do. And by the way, they often keep their mouths shut and they're more sagacious than you think they are because they keep their mouth shut. So it's I don't know. I think it's 60. Extroverts. You take a Bill Clinton. He's one of the most extroverted people I've ever met, and he liked everybody, and he was and he enjoyed talking to them. When he met my mom when she maybe was 65 or 70. And then 3 years later, I brought her. She came when I was in the White House, or 2 years later. She came and I took her into the Oval Office to see Clinton, and he remembered her name, her nickname. He, from all the thousands upon thousands of people he met, he could remember their names. He could remember their conversations. It was really astonishing. But you also realize that sometimes while he was talking to you very intently, he'd also be looking over his shoulder at the person behind you, trying to see, how can I bring them over? His whole modus operandi was seduction. He was really good at seduction, men and women. He was powerfully. He had a powerful personality, and I think it did serve him well as president. Franklin Roosevelt was deeply engaged in human relationships, and that experience, especially after he had polio and he'd been knocked down so hard, it was the makings of Franklin Roosevelt as a leader. So often, I think that I don't think there's any black and white on this. I think there are some extroverts who are terrifically not very good leaders, and there are some introverts who are good leaders.
What do you mean by self-mastery?
We all have a bright side, but we also have, as Carl Jung used to argue, we have a bright side, but we also have a dark side. Almost all of us. Very, very few people. And the question in life is whether you can integrate your dark side with your bright side and to keep it integrated so that you keep it under control. That's really important for getting along with people. I worked with Richard Nixon my first big job in Washington. I went to work in his White House, and at first, what I saw of Nixon was in meetings. I was because I was a note taker in some of the meetings, and I had a chance to see him, and he was the best strategist that I've ever met in public life. Figuratively, he and Henry Kissinger could go up on the mountaintop and look back into the past, and because looking back in the past, they also gathered capacity to look further forward. That's what Churchill always believed. You can look further back and see further forward. So anyway, with Nixon, best strategist, but he had demons inside him that he had never mastered. That thing, life got away from him. He was a man with a lot of grievances, a lot of inner anger, and he believed because he was so narcissistic and also so stubborn about things. He believed that unless you were for him, you must be his enemy. And he kept a list of his enemies and went after them. You remember he tapped their phones, including journalists, as well as he wiretapped his Secretary of Defense, in effect, his own people. So he had this sense of grievances and he had these demons. And eventually they brought him down. They sending people into the Watergate and then lying about it and having all the lost 17 minutes and all those things we talk about. Still about Watergate. And by the way, I think we're coming up to, just in the next 2 or 3 days, the anniversary of Watergate. I think the 40th or 50th anniversary. I have to do a quick calculation. But in any event, when David Frost, the British journalist, interviewed Nixon shortly after Nixon had left California scandal, of shame, David Frost asked him, "Tell me in a nutshell what happened. How did this happen? How did you go down like this?" And Nixon said, "I gave my enemies a sword, and then they ran me through." That's exactly what happened. He was responsible for his own shortcoming. He was the author of his own life, so to speak. And I think because he hadn't been able to deal with this, he probably could have had some years of therapy. He might have done a lot better. In those days, of course, if you saw a therapist, that was regarded as a sign of weakness. And people were scared. People in politics were generally scared to do. And Nixon did. But it was so clear that he would have benefited from. As one of his aides, Bryce Carlisle, used to say, "It's not clear. You never know who did something bad to him when he was young, but it sure was a terrible thing he did."
In the section about launching your career, you mentioned that you should always keep a parachute in your closet.
Yeah, right.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, jobs in politics, you're facing a slippery slope. You're a slippery pole. How do you climb the slippery pole and not keep sliding back? And that's a big question. But the people's reputation rise and fall, and you can be a great advisor to a president in January, and by June you are not sure welcome, and he thinks you're really allowed, and you're in the wilderness again. So and my own view is what's important is to try to do what's right. Try to help the person you're advising do what's right. Spend your capital doing what's right. And there may come a time when you go into the wilderness again, and you just got to have a parachute in the closet. You got to have some means in the closet to protect yourself. The number I've often heard is you want to have too much savings lined up, so that whatever happens to you if you get fired, you've got 2 months there to get your bills in order, get your life in order. All of us have been fired at one point or another, or we've become into seen as overbearing or dumb or stupid or whatever it may be. But that goes with the territory, especially if you want to be a leader. There's some people who are going to really cheer you on. They're going to respect you, and they're going to think that you're doing great things. You're doing the Lord's work. And there are other people who try to bring you down. And they will take pride and pleasure in seeing your demise. And you just have to be aware that life can be pretty rough. We've known that since Machiavelli. We're no better. We're not angels.
You talk about the importance of coaches and mentors and role models. Can you give a couple examples of leaders who really benefited from a mentor or a role model or a coach?
Well, famously, Philip of Macedon, going way back to ancient times, hired Aristotle to be the mentor and coach of his son, Alexander the Great. And Alexander listened closely to Aristotle, followed him a lot, and read in the classics. It was said that at night when he was in his tent, he would have 2 things under his pillow. One would be a copy of the Odyssey, and the other would be his long knife. He needed both. But another more modern example, contemporary to me, I'm sure for a lot of folks it's no longer. But take a guy like Dwight Eisenhower, who had some natural leadership tendencies. The kids like to look to him to organize their football games, their baseball games, and all that sort of thing on the athletic field. But he was not a good student, and he finished West Point pretty low down in the class. Not as low as John McCain, but pretty down low. And it didn't look like he had all that much of a future in military. And there was a time when he was thinking about leaving. But he, on one of his assignments in Panama, there was a man, Fox Connor, who was famous for being mentor to a number of military officers. And Fox Connor took Ike under his wing in Panama. They would go out and ride together, a horseback ride in Panama almost every day. And Connor would steer him. And Connor then started bringing him books to read and told him, you want to read this, you want to read that. And Ike became a reader. But he because of Connor, he really matured a lot. He sharpened his views. He developed his true north. He was a much more reliable leader than he had been. And when he went to his next assignment, which was to go out to command the General Staff School, which was done out at Fort Leavenworth, he was at the top of his class coming out of that. He just nailed it. He came alive in large part, because Fox Connor had to take him under his wing. And he wouldn't have been Eisenhower without Fox Connor.
That's a great example.
Yeah. And what I would also say is one of the good things that I think we can celebrate these days about leadership development was there was a period of time when women rose to the top and had such a terrible struggle getting there that they really felt that it was important that their successors also have a struggle, because maybe that would make them better, or maybe that just made them feel like life isn't fair, whatever. And so they shied away from coaching other young women. Men were often scared of coaching women because then all sorts of rumors started about their relationship. And so as a result, there were a lot of women who never had the kind of sponsorship or mentorship that they should have. And that has now changed. You know, it was often said recently, there's a place in hell for a woman who won't help another woman. No, Madeleine Albright loved that.
Yes, that was Madeleine Albright. Yeah.
That was Madeleine Albright. You know, she loved to quote that line.
We're getting some questions in from the audience on YouTube. Some of them are about leadership and some of them are about politics, of course.
Yeah, one and the same, aren't they? In some many ways.
What do you view as the greatest threat to democracy today?
Good question. I think the two things. One is that that we're drifting in a way in our relationship with China and Russia that we could be drifting toward conflict. And I remember when Kissinger worked with Nixon, and one of the good things they did, and speaking of good strategists, they saw that China and Russia in those days, in the 70s, early 70s, were locked at the hip, and they were coming after the United States and wanted to destroy the United States. Khrushchev bragged, "We're leaving 12 feet under," that sort of thing. And what Kissinger and Nixon did was to divide China and Russia apart. That's why Kissinger went to China, and why Nixon went to China, was to have a divide and conquer kind of strategy. That if you drive China and Russia apart, you keep each one of them weaker, and you strengthen the United States, and you can play them off against each other. That worked really well, and it helped end the Cold War. There are signs today that we're trying to drive them back together. Why that would be happening, I do not know. I don't know. I can't see what's in it for us. And I do think it can be exceedingly dangerous, especially if Putin feels he's cornered and he starts lashing out. He has at his fingertips, he has nuclear weapons, and it could be quite dangerous. So I don't know why to wake up in the morning and see headlines about our U.S. China, is a conflict deepening, as opposed to, wouldn't it be nice if we could open the newspaper and would say, U.S. diplomats trying hard to develop a peace agreement with China. That's where I think we ought to be, and I don't understand it. And I think it's dangerous. We shouldn't mindlessly allow this relationship to go off the tracks. But China is doing some terrible things. We have to be tough with them. We have to be tough negotiators. But let's stay out of any kind of conflict. President Biden, to his credit, has stayed out of conflict in Ukraine. We're not deeply into it. That's a good thing, and he's done a good job, frankly, in assembling Western nations as a strong barrier to the Russians just marauding and brutally killing a lot more people. So I think there's much that Biden has done we can be thankful for. It doesn't seem to be penetrated in terms of his standing with the American people politically. He's no better off than he was several weeks ago, as the surveys over this last few days have underlined. So that's one issue. But the other issue, which we don't talk about enough, but it came very much rushing to the fore with this shooting in Buffalo. And that is the degree to which a growing number of Americans are worried or scared that they're going to lose their jobs to immigrants or to people of color. They're going to be pushed away from the table. A third of Americans now worry, according to one survey by Quinnipiac, I think. A third of the people said, we want to push back. We want to push the people of color back. We want to push the immigrants back. This is our country. We're going to let this country be overwhelmed. This is basically a white country, should be a white country. And you have this kind of drumbeat now of sort of white supremacy coming to the surface. It used to be hidden. Now it's more on the surface. That in itself, I think, is dangerous. But the other part of this is how do you create a multi-ethnic society that is successful when you are losing your majority, when the majority numbers are going down, and minority numbers are coming up? So we're heading in within a fairly modest period of time. We're going to be in a situation where whites are going to be in a minority, and there's going to be no majority of anything. Blacks won't be in a majority, and Asians won't be in a majority, Hispanics won't be in a majority. There'll be groups of minorities. And what in the literature now that's developing, it's almost a cottage industry of books about the dangers of authoritarianism and how democracy died. One book written by two prominent Harvard professors teaching my class. I invite every year. They're so good. Their book is called How Democracies Die. And it points out that no multi-ethnic society in which there has been no majority to keep peace and keep order has ever survived as a democracy. They're growing number of books. This is really worth paying attention to because we have to find ways to create a more respectful relationship among us, that independent of the color of our skin, our sexuality, where we went to school, all those kinds of things. We need to create a new culture, a civic culture, in which there's service, in which you see yourself if you're a leader. You're a servant leader. A leader is someone who does service to others. And we have to move in that direction, I think, to head this off. Because if we have little pockets of minorities here and there, people are just identified and they think home base is their identity group, it just makes life a heck of a lot harder. It's much, much harder to do tough things. It's much harder for people to lead in this environment. It's so poisonous. And so that's why I consider myself a short-term pessimist. I want to before we close, I do want to say I also think though there is you can see glimmers of hope on the horizon now, and I'm increasingly convinced that while the next few years are going to be extremely rough, the years after that could be much, much better if we work now with the younger generation and start passing as often as we can to Generation X and to the millennials and Generation Z. Those people deserve a time of that. I think it's time for the baton to be passed as much as we can. I think it's time for some of our political leaders to step back, allow and open the door so some of these young, talented people can have a better shot at helping to become the leaders of tomorrow. And I think that responsibility goes with territory. If you're older, I just turned 80, and I can tell you, I have real qualms about the next president of the United States being in his 80s or her 80s. I'm not sure that's the best talent. That's the best use of talent. I think older people can still offer a lot of advice. They can still mentor. They can still sponsor. They can still help produce a culture. They can work on nonprofit organizations. They can do a lot of things like that. There are careers after your first career that you increasingly can do in life, and that's a good place for people to be. But let's give our younger people a shot, and let them help. They'll bring fresh energy. They'll bring fresh vision, and and we ought to pay attention to how they see the world. One of the problems if you're in your 80s trying to engage with somebody in their 20s, that is not an easy conversation barrier. You can easily misunderstand or not understand people who are 60 years younger than you are. One of the things that Coach K did at Duke that was so good, was so smart, was, he had about a 40, 50-year difference between himself and his players on the basketball team. And he hired associate coaches who were somewhere in the middle and could inform the top guy and keep him abreast of the feelings in the crowd of the young, and to keep the young apprised of what the coach thought. It was a very smart thing to do. We need more mechanisms and more ways of communicating with each other and trying to work together. I am a big national service person. I really believe that we ought to be encouraging every 18 to 24-year-old person to give a year back to their communities, to work somewhere in their communities, maybe schools, dropout rates, trying to keep the dropout rates down. It could be helping people read. It could be working in hospitals. There are just so many different things that you can do now, and we're understaffed in so many different ways, and we're not getting the right results. So I think if you gave you're back to the community. We ought to then take a year off your tuition debt. If you work 2 years, you got 2 years off your debt. And if you grew up in rural America, let's have you do some things in urban America. And if you grew up in urban America, let's have you go on the farm in rural America. Understand how they live out there and why they are as they are and why they're so concerned about what's going on now. I think we have a long way to go, but we can get there if we realize that we have a vision that brings us together. And we're all, it's often said we came in different ships, but now we're in the same boat together. And I believe that. And I think we've got to keep that foremost in our minds.
Great. Another question from the audience. Earlier, you mentioned your concerns about misinformation.
Yes.
Any thoughts about what can be done to combat that?
Well, I think the critical thing is that we have to develop institutions and tradition people can trust. In the last 20, 30, 40 years, we've lied so often to the American people. We've overpromised and underdelivered so often that there's an exhaustion level now on the populace. There's an anger that's out there, and there's been loss of faith, trust in what we're being told. We just don't believe it. We're sort of show me as opposed to tell me kind of situation. And I think there's a responsibility for the media, for starters, to do everything we can to encourage transparency and honest reporting. I think we ought to get back to the old-fashioned idea that the front page of the newspaper is for news, and the opinion ought to be in the opinion section. We don't need to have the opinion running through the news, and we don't need to be interpreted. Give us the facts, and let us make up our own minds. That was the arguments. Let's have, in particular, the media be very straight about this. I think our universities have to do that as well. There's been a temptation on many campuses sort of to retreat over into the left, and there's a legitimate concern on the right about whether this is we're being fed morsels of, in effect, disinformation or biased accounting, and I don't think that means that we have to have a whole lot hire a lot of conservatives, but I do think it is because I don't run a liberal side, but I think we're going to have a much stronger democracy. Have people who are on the left and people on the right try to hash this out and do it together. And if you have service together, if you have sort of communal service, like building houses together or doing whatever you may do in the community, you'll find that relationship will change a lot. It's like going to college for the first time you talk to people who ever have experiences in life that are not like yours. And in the beginning, you may not feel comfortable with it. But the longer you get to know that person, you may really feel, closer. We ought to be doing that with the Asian society. Yeah. The Asians are doing so well in our universities that it's causing some grievance, a sense of grievances among some of the people. So many white, we're going to get displaced. We need people who are going to be sensitive, and we need people who are not going to be clinging to power. But I really want to leave behind a legacy that people will look back and say, that person really cared about us as a people.
Actually, we've reached the end of the program, and I was going to ask one last question, but you actually just answered it, because I was going to say what matters most in leaders today, and I think you just told us what you feel. Is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I think you go back to something very familiar. You need the capabilities of a strong leader, you need the courage of a strong leader, and you need the character of a strong leader. 3 C's. Very simple. Remember, hard to do, but good luck. Again, I'm so pleased to have a chance to talk to you all at the Commonwealth Club. I respect a great deal of what you do. I think you're serving the public of your city and your community extremely well. So it's great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Our thanks to David Gergen, author of Hearts Touched with Fire, How Great Leaders Are Made. We encourage you to pick up your copy of David's new book at your local bookstore. If you'd like to watch more programs or support the Commonwealth Club's efforts in making both virtual and in-person programming possible, please visit commonwealthclub.org/events. Thank you, and see you next time.
Thank you.